So you have your MJML template ready to go, and you've created a beautiful version in Webflow for your newsletter. Now what? Well, in this video, we're going to start piecing it all together, and we're going to be adding some placeholder information into the MJML template, and then take a look at the Webflow API to see how we can put the dynamic data into that placeholder. So first things first, you might notice that I did set up a GitHub repo. What you'll notice is that it's a lot larger than it used to be. So if we take a look at the VS Code files here, then you will see that there is now a min file for everything. Shout out to my friend Corsetti Dev, who really just informed me that what all I was trying to do was minify these to get them into Xano properly. So to make it easy, that's what we've done, is we have minified each. And so there's a app that I use, Minify All, or extension in VS Code, that you can use, and then when we go through it, and if you make changes, it will automatically minify with the changes that you've made. So if we made some changes here, we can minify, and it's going to minify our the proper file that we have. Also notice that it says HTML here. These are MJML, the code is, but in order to minify it properly, we had to just change the extension name to HTML. So probably none of this stuff really matters, but I wanted to just be clear about how we were separating this all. The other thing that has been done is we separated the columns. So for those areas that we were sticking in dynamic columns, we separated those out into separate files, again, because the minification was easier that way. So let's just take a look at our code here. So we went through and we did the full HTML and MJML, and then we had so we kind of talked about this being in the head, and then we have each of our sections, which is going to be replaced. And so we kind of did that. So that's part of it. But now what we're going to do is in some of these sections, we have dynamic data that we need to identify as being dynamic data. And so people have their own ways of doing this. I'm using a $sign in front of things and trying to keep our naming conventions pretty straightforward. So let's just take a look at our intro. So here's our intro document, and I have a logo that is going to be the same every single time, or the word mark, so that's going to be fine. But then you'll start to see in this next one, I have an item title, and so that's the newsletter name. So the newsletter name is going to be different each time, and so I want to account for that. So I'm using camel case and a $sign here to indicate that this is going to be replaceable data. It's very easy for Xano then to be able to use replace if we set up this kind of system in what we're doing. And same thing here with date. The date is going to be dynamic, and I think that's, and newsletter URL. We're also pulling that as well, which is a URL. And we have the image source and also alt text. Note that in MJML, you can add alt to an image, which is alt text, which is a good practice to do for accessibility reasons and whatnot. And so we have the ability to do it. So we can pull in that alt text, which we should have a field for in Webflow as well. So we can pull that in. So it kind of gives you a breakdown just simply in this particular intro. And then we basically follow the same thing with all of the other ones. And so if we're going to be going into, let's go to the new release section. There we go. And for this one here, this is where I'm using this $insert. And this tells me that I'm going to be inserting columns in this place. And then if we look into the actual new release column, we can see, again, we've got it set up so it's $, the source is image, $URL, $title, type, artist name. Your content is going to have, you know, however you want to do it. But if we look at what this looks like in our MJML file here, we have, again, newsletter name, and you can start to see where we're going to be putting in and what we're going to be putting in. So it's very clear about what dynamic data that we're going to be putting in. Excellent. So let's go take a look at the Webflow API, and actually a little bit of Xano before we do that, so that we can just start creating this. So the first thing we want to do, if we have not ever used Webflow's API before, is we are going to have to give permission, and we have to create an API token for Xano to be able to use it. So if you are in your workspace, you could go to the settings for the site, the particular site that you have, and then if you go into apps and integrations, you can see I already have some connected. But what we're going to do is we're just going to generate. You click on generate API token, rather, and then you can set the different permissions for what you're actually going to be, you know, required for this. For this particular stuff, a lot of it's actually going to be CMS, and we want read and write access. We may even only need read for this particular thing, but sometimes if you want to have a little bit, don't give all of the permissions to something if you're only using it for something. And so that we could create a token name and call this newsletter, and we know that it's specifically for this. I mean, people have different ways of doing permissions. Because I use this particular token with Webflow for a lot of different things, it has very open permissions, my API key, and you're going to want to generate your API key, you generate your token, and then save it somewhere. So a really good place to save it is actually in Xano itself. And we're going to be placing it there anyway, but we can save it in the settings in Xano, and we're going to create an environment variable. So if we go into manage, these are all nicely hidden by default, so I don't have to do any blurring, but we already can see that, I don't think I have a search in here, but we have a Webflow bearer, and that's the token that we use, is the Webflow bearer token. And you can pop the value into here, and then you can, you know, save. It'll bring up a save, and now we can use this environmental variable for all of the API calls. I'm not actually going to create an API function. What I'm going to do, or an API in the API group for this, what I like to do is I actually like to use, in the library you have this option of creating functions. Functions are great because they are reusable. And so if we build something, so for instance, let's say we build out this newsletter, but we want to apply it to a different newsletter in the future, we can create all the building blocks for it, and we may have to do some tweaking depending on what our names of things are and stuff like that. But we can create it as a building block that we can reuse it, and that's what functions are great for. They are also secure. They can only be accessed through your account, and so they don't have to be, they're not locked down in the same way that an API call is. And for this instance, if you're manually doing this, there's no reason to have an API call, like if you're manually hitting the download button. But we will set it up at the very end with an API so that we can then externally hit the API key to get the download, or the API to get the download. But let's just create a function in the function stack here. So let's just go create MJML newsletter. And this is creation of newsletter. You can put a better description in there, but that's good enough for now. So we're going to save that. And here we have our function stack. Now the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to get our newsletter. And so we're going to make an API call to the Webflow API using the function stack. So let's hop in here first, and we're going to add a function. We're going to go API, and we want external API request. Now, we can go and find out all of this information, but Xano is really helpful in the fact that it lets us import curls. So let's go back to our, or I guess we haven't even probably looked at it yet, but let's go take a look at something super handy. This is the Webflow Developers. So this is all of your information for how to access the APIs and the calls that are needed for them. You can list pages, you can get different things. Now keep in mind, because of the permissions that you set in that API key that you, or API token that you created, that is going to determine what parts of this you can actually access. So if you set your permissions to be just like CMS read and write, you're only going to be able to access this CMS portion of things. It won't allow you to do any of these other, and like depending on what you're doing with it, you want to give it the least permissions possible, and you know, Webflow recommends even changing out your API tokens, refreshing them and changing them out reasonably frequently as well. Or if you know that something's been compromised, that's, you just go into Webflow like we did earlier and create a new one, and then just change, and then you just swap it out. Like you can go into the settings in Xano and swap out the thing. Now what we're doing is we want to get live items. So we want a list of live collection items. That is what we're going to be looking at right off the bat, is we're going to be grabbing a list of live collection items, because our newsletters are going to be live on the Webflow site, and what we're doing is we want to take that newsletter and we want to put it into this MJML email and zip it down and then have it available for loops. So that is what we're doing. So if you go along the side here, we've found our list live collection, and here, over here is the handy URL. And so the curl has, different curls are going to have different information. Webflow basically gives us the URL, and then we need a token and stuff like that. So what we do is we're set up to the curl here, and we're just going to copy to clipboard, and then we're going to go back to our MJML newsletter function here, and we're going to import this curl. So I'm just copying and pasting, and we're importing it, and all of these values get put in here. So it's super handy for us.